What's up, everybody? My name is Zach Pasquello, and this video is part 2 where I talk about chart of accounts and categorizing transactions, mastering bookkeeping in your QuickBooks. Yesterday I made a video and I talked about categories for the balance sheet, and then I started getting into categories and chart of accounts for profit and loss statement. If you missed yesterday's video, I recommend watch that one first because, like I said, this is part 2. Yesterday was part 1. So I make these videos every single day. If you enjoy this video, please like the video. And if you want to see more, subscribe to my channel because I post videos every single day. And my goal is to teach people how to start and grow a bookkeeping business. Or maybe even if you're a business owner, I teach you a lot of good tips and tricks for your bookkeeping, for managing your QuickBooks, and also just business in general. I also offer mentorship. So if you're thinking about starting a bookkeeping business, or if you've already started and you need help growing your bookkeeping business, there's a link in the description below. You can schedule a one-on-one meeting with me. I would love to work with you. Now, I don't want to waste any time, so let's jump right into it. I'm going to pick up where we left off. I'm going to be talking about categories and chart of accounts. So as a bookkeeper, you're going to be doing a 3-step process to do bookkeeping, and that is you categorize transactions, and then step 2 is you reconcile people's accounts, and then step 3 you generate financial statements. Pretty straightforward process. I'm going to be focusing on step number 1, categorizing transactions, and we're going to be utilizing the chart of accounts to categorize transactions. So like I said, if you missed yesterday's video, I recommend watch part 1 because I talk about exactly what are chart of accounts. And basically, anytime I use the word category, that is synonymous with chart of accounts. So category equals chart of accounts and vice versa. And today we're going to be picking up where I left off yesterday, talking about profit and loss chart of accounts. So these are typical categories that you're going to use to categorize your client's transactions. So if you do bookkeeping for a business owner, they're going to be using their debit card, their checking account, their credit card to spend money. So anytime they spend money, you need to categorize those transactions appropriately. And I'm going to talk about individual categories that you can use to do your client's bookkeeping. So I was talking about, okay, so we're going to start with depreciation today. Depreciation is kind of a complex one, and depreciation is actually a non-cash transaction. So you will need to do some type of journal entry to capture depreciation, and I'm not going to get too deep into it, but there is a book value for depreciation and there's a tax value for depreciation. So your tax accountant, whenever they file your taxes, they are going to have a certain number for depreciation, and then you might have a different number in the books for depreciation. But basically, to summarize this, so most vehicles and most equipment has a useful life of 5 years. So for example, if you just buy a piece of equipment that's going to last 5 years, let's say for $50,000, it's going to last, we'll keep it simple, we'll make it $60,000. So it's going to last 5 years, which is 60 months. So $60,000 divided by 5 years, that equals $1,000 per month in depreciation. So like I said, this is a non-cash transaction. This is a pretty specific example, and without getting too much more into the details, if you want to capture depreciation on a piece of equipment that your client just bought, then just take the total purchase value, divide it by the months that they're going to be using that piece of equipment, and then that is your monthly expense for depreciation. It's going to be a journal entry. So you're going to debit depreciation, and you're going to credit accumulated depreciation, and that's all I'm going to talk about that. Kind of a complex topic, but depreciation is another category that you can use. Okay, another category is called dues and descriptions. I don't really use this category, but a lot of times people use dues and subscription for like monthly recurring payments. So like if you have a Dropbox account, or if you have an Adobe account or a Netflix account, or if you have any sort of monthly subscription, people will use this category, but I don't really recommend using this category. I actually prefer, and I'll tell you what I prefer to use later, equipment rental. So if you have a company that rents maybe a truck, maybe they're renting a box truck to make deliveries, or maybe you have a general contractor and they're renting some piece of equipment to do repairs as a general contractor, or maybe you have a business that has an office and maybe they rent like a printer or a copier. That would all be considered equipment rental. Now this is different from a lease. So if you have a company that has equipment that's leased, that would be different. This is just strictly rental. Okay, fuel. Oftentimes this can just be lumped in together with car and truck, or maybe even travel expense, but some people like to differentiate between their fuel. So if if they have a car that they use exclusively for business, or if they have maybe a trucking company, or maybe they're a general contractor and they have a work van or a work truck and they go to gas stations frequently, then you can just have your own category for fuel. Okay, hotel, this is another category that's pretty specific, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend having a separate category for a hotel unless they go to hotels a lot. So like if your client is going to a hotel like every single week, then maybe have a separate category. But if it's once in a while, they rarely go to a hotel, I would actually just lump hotel into a travel category. Okay, the next category is insurance. Now you can break insurance down into sub accounts. You can have general liability insurance, you can have auto insurance, you can have health insurance, or you can just put everything into an insurance category. But this is pretty self-explanatory. Most businesses have some type of insurance. Interest expense is another pretty common category, especially if your client has loans. So anytime there's a loan, anytime you're paying off that loan on a monthly basis, you're going to pay some portion of that monthly payment towards principal and some portion of that monthly payment towards interest. It's really important. Make sure you get those monthly statements so that you can separate interest and principal. And then finally, if they have a credit card and they don't pay the full balance every single month, there will be some interest expense associated with that credit card. Job supplies is a super broad category. I use this one all the time. So if you have a cleaning company and they go to Walmart and they buy towels and Windex, that would be job supplies. If you have a general contractor and they go to Walmart or they go to Home Depot or Lowe's and they pretty much buy anything, that would probably be considered job supplies. If you have a mechanic or like an auto shop and they buy wrenches or tools, that would be considered probably job supplies. Anything that your client is using on a daily basis to perform their services, that would be job supplies. Legal and professional services. I also see some people do sub accounts. Like underneath this, they'll have legal fees. Underneath that, they'll have accounting fees. But any sort of legal and professional services, maybe if you have like an IT consultant, or if you hire a bookkeeper like me, or an accountant or an attorney, those would all be legal and professional services. Meals, so you have meals. Sometimes you can break this into additional subcategories. You might have travel meals, you might have meals with clients. I generally just lump everything together as meals. Keep in mind, in 2021 and 2022, meals were 100% deductible. However, in 2023, that is no longer the case. Once again, meals are only 50% deductible. This is another big category that I use all the time: office supplies and software. And I see a lot of people having like 5 or 6 subcategories under office supplies and software. I really like to keep my profit and loss statement as simple as possible. I truly believe nobody's profit and loss statement should be more than 1 page long. So if you have a 3-page or a 2-page profit and loss statement, you might want to look into consolidating some of your categories. Like I see some people have office supplies and software, and then underneath that they'll have like software, they'll have shipping and postage, they'll have general office supplies. I like to keep, like I said, I like to keep my chart of accounts and my profit or loss as simple as possible. So I only really have this one category. I try to avoid having sub accounts underneath office supplies and software. But at the end of the day, it's all about personal preference. What do you prefer? What does your client prefer? But that's just what I prefer. This is a huge category. Anytime I'm going to Office Max or Amazon, or anytime I pay for my QuickBooks subscription, or if you pay for like a website, that a website might be advertising and marketing, or it might be office supplies and software. So back whenever I was talking about dues and subscriptions, I typically take everything from dues and subscriptions and I put them in office supplies and software. That's just my personal preference. Other miscellaneous expense, I think this is a category that should be avoided at all costs. I never use this category, but I see a lot of business owners who aren't necessarily bookkeepers use this category a lot just because they don't know how to categorize something. And to me, this is just kind of, I don't want to use the word lazy bookkeeping, but to me, this is just kind of looks like lazy bookkeeping. This adds no value to me when I'm looking at the P&L. I say, okay, well, great, there's just a miscellaneous category. Like I would much rather see this be accurately split up between maybe job supplies or office supplies or permits, license, and fees. Like I strongly recommend stay away from this category. Okay, if you're using a payroll company to pay employees, you're going to have 3 separate categories. You're going to have the wages, the taxes, and the processing fees. Strongly recommend keep all 3 of these things separate. because whenever you get your W-2 or your W-3 at the end of the year, you will want to know, okay, how much did I pay in payroll wages? How much did I pay in payroll taxes? And you want to make sure you separate out that additional payroll processing. Postage and freight. Okay, so if you are selling products and you're actually shipping them through the mail, then I would maybe consider this to be cost of goods sold, postage and freight. But if you just have a business and you're just randomly using the UPS to like mail business documents, I would actually categorize those transactions as office supplies and software. So I don't really use this category unless I have a business that sells a lot of products and actually ships those products to their customers. Here's another category, professional fees. I already talked about legal and professional services. This is just another name for that category. It doesn't really matter what you call it as long as you're consistent and as long as it makes sense. So you can have professional fees, you can have legal and professional services. It doesn't really matter, just as long as it makes sense to you and you categorize things appropriately. Here's another category, registration fees. So if you have a trucking company, this might make sense. I would probably call this vehicle registration, but this also probably goes in line with that previous category that I talked about, like business licenses, permits, and fees. I wouldn't necessarily have a separate registration fee category because probably all of the things that go into this category could also go into that licenses, permits, and fees categories. But a lot of times if people register their business on an annual basis, like their LLC registration fees, then I see people categorizing that under registration fees. But I would just avoid this category and maybe use vehicle registration or just licenses, permits, and fees. Okay, rent expense. This is probably only should be used for property that you're renting. So a building for your office or your storefront, that would be rent expense. If you're renting equipment, I would differentiate that from like a building rent expense, and I would say equipment rental or vehicle rental. But rent expense should almost exclusively be for your office or your storefront. Repairs and maintenance. This is a pretty big category. So if we have a general contractor, like pretty much all they do is repairs and maintenance. So it wouldn't really make sense to use this category for a general contractor for like services they're providing. But if you have an office or if you have a store, and if somebody, like if you hire a plumber because the toilet in your restaurant is clogged, like that would definitely be repairs and maintenance. For me, I used to have a trucking company, so anytime I would get my trucks repaired, that would be repairs and maintenance. But you can see how obviously in those two businesses, like this category has a completely different meaning. So maybe instead of using something generic like repairs and maintenance, maybe you could say like building repairs or vehicle repairs. That might make more sense. Or if you have an office and you hire a landscaping company, that might be considered maintenance for your office. But every business is going to be different. Just anytime you hire somebody like a mechanic or a subcontractor to repair like something in your business, I would probably categorize it under this. And then just keep in mind that if you have different assets that you're repairing or maintaining, or different spaces or different locations, maybe have some sub accounts or maybe have some extra clarification on what exactly are you repairing or what exactly are you maintaining. Another example is if you have a manufacturing company and they have equipment inside their manufacturing plant and they bring someone in to repair their equipment, that would be once again a completely different repairs and maintenance category. So just look at the type of business that you're doing bookkeeping for and adjust your categories accordingly. Okay, I do see some people have a separate telephone expense. I would not consider your cell phone bill or your telephone expense to be utilities. I would not have this category, and I would just lump all of that into office supplies and software. But if you or your client really wants to differentiate between your cell phone bill, or maybe you have an office phone and you want to differentiate between that bill, then maybe you can have a separate telephone expense. But I think it's unnecessary. I would just group that in with office supplies and software. Or if it's not for your office and you have maybe a cell phone bill for one of your drivers or one of your subcontractors, maybe that could be considered job supplies. But I would not have a separate telephone expense category. Okay, tolls. So I reference the trucking company a lot because I had a trucking company and I work with a lot of trucking clients. But if you have a trucking company, absolutely have a separate tolls category. But if you don't have a trucking company, then you don't need a separate tolls category. Just group this in with your automobile expense or your car and truck expense. You don't need a separate tolls category unless you have a trucking. Tools and small equipment. Once again, I think this is an unnecessary category. I think this could all just be considered job supplies. So if you see this on your client's profit and loss, ask them, hey, do you mind if I get rid of this category and just consolidate it with job supplies? Or if you really want to have this separate category, go for it. If your client loves it, keep it. But I would not have tools and small equipment. I would just have job supplies. Okay, we have travel here. So if your client or if the business you're doing bookkeeping for travels a lot, it'll make sense to have a separate travel category. I've seen things underneath travel like airfare and hotels. You could have separate categories: travel, airfare, travel, hotels, or you could have sub accounts under travel. Me personally, I'm not a big fan of sub accounts unless they're absolutely necessary. So I would just lump together everything under travel. And if they're getting a hotel or if they're paying for an airplane ticket, I would just say that's all considered travel. Okay, utilities here. This is one of the last categories. So like I said, a cell phone bill or internet, in my opinion, should not be utilities. I would say your cell phone bill or your office telephone or your internet should be office supplies and software. I think utilities should only be electricity, gas, and trash and water. So if you have an office or if you have a building, then those things should be considered utilities. And then the last thing we'll talk about, so I do see some people have this category called Ask My Accountant. So if you're a bookkeeper, you probably should not be using this account unless you absolutely have to, because you probably are the accountant. But if you're a business owner, it's fine to use this category. Just don't forget to ask your accountant and ask them quickly. Don't wait until taxes to ask them, because your accountant's probably super busy and doesn't want to answer a million questions. So make sure you're asking these questions in real time. And then finally, same thing with uncategorized expense. This should only be a temporary categorization. You should never be generating financial statements with this uncategorized expense. You should be answering these questions before the end of the month. That way you have accurate books, because these are not accurate categorizations. These are just temporary accounts while you try to find the right answer.